There is another reason why Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, is so widely remembered, and that is because of this single room. Here we are in the Our Lady Chapel attached to St. Mary's Collegiate Church in Warwick, and indeed this room is more widely known as the Beauchamp Chapel. This entire portion of the building and this interior was commissioned by Richard Beauchamp at his death in 1439. We know a lot about it because it's mentioned even in his will. And unfortunately, though, we don't have such a great sense of what Richard Beauchamp's household looked like in the interiors of his castles. If it was anything like this building, his household must have been absolutely spectacular.
No, you're right. This building, this room particularly, it has to be one of the most stunning 15th century rooms in the whole of England. But what do we know, Adam, about Richard's household and the kind of world that he lived in?
Well, we know that Richard really kept an enormously highly cultured household. He, of course, had married two women of remarkable status from the Berkeley and then later the Despencer families, who were both well-educated and book collectors in their own right. And really, we also have a great sense that Richard was a keen patron of the arts. I mean, not just relating to this particular building, let's say, but even we know that he was a great collector of books. The Beauchamps, we know already in the early part of the 14th century, were collectors of manuscripts, including Guy de Beauchamp. You know, they owned some really very important and lavish works of art in manuscript form. We know that. We also know that Richard de Beauchamp was a known patron of writers. There are a few names, and very important names, that are actually attached to him. Firstly, there is a great story that even Sir Thomas Malory, the writer of the Mort d'Arthur, the great Arthurian legend, might have even served with Beauchamp at the Siege of Calais during the campaigns of Henry V. We have to be slightly sceptical of this. There is no firm evidence for it. Beauchamp's secretary was another prestigious writer, a man called John Shirley, who was a notorious collector of poems. And indeed, there is a poem book in the British Library which was amassed by Shirley, undoubtedly for Richard Beauchamp, which is very significant. We know Beauchamp owned collections of poems by Froissart and chansons, so lots of French song and music. And also there are other figures who he's connected with, including the great John Lydgate, who we know had presented poems and works to the Earl of Warwick. Lydgate actually wrote a version of the Guy of Warwick story for Richard's daughter Margaret Talbot. And so again, you could imagine that Richard had at his disposal some very significant writers to help, create these wonderful myths for him in manuscripts, which would have been beautifully illustrated.
One of the things I absolutely love, actually, about Shirley's work is he includes within his portfolio a poem supposedly written by Richard himself to his wife, and I've got a bit of an excerpt here that I'm going to read to you, and I want to imagine this is Richard writing to his wife from France. I mean, this is almost the poem of a lovesick teenager who's missing his young, attractive wife. And the poem goes, and he writes, "I cannot half to you complain, that doth my woful heart strain, with hissy thought and grievous pain, when I not see my fair lady, whose beauty so fully present is in me. For she alone in virtue is, and there have none doubt with her, that doth not always praise her manner, her womankind, her lusty cheer. So would God, my lady dear, at my request and my prayer, your lust to rule." I mean, it's not the best poetry of the 15th century, that can be said, but this is a really kind of passionate, really kind of full-blooded poem that's written by this lord.
And of course, we have to remember that chivalry wasn't just about going off and winning successful military campaigns and jousting, but it also had a very strong poetic element in this period. Architecturally, we also know that Richard Beauchamp was heavily involved in several enormous projects. He owned castles, of course, not only in Warwickshire, but through Worcestershire, Gloucestershire, and really he was connected with lots of religious institutions and buildings, not only at Malvern, let's say, but also at Tewkesbury. And I think one of the things is if you travel around the old beautiful churches of this part of the world, then you will see Beauchamp coat of arms plastered absolutely everywhere on walls and decorations, even on tiles. But of course, Richard Beauchamp's patronage today is known specifically for this one room, the Beauchamp Chapel. And what a beautiful space it is. I don't know about you, Aaron, but every time I come here, despite the fact of how many times I've come here, it still takes my breath away at the beauty of this room, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you can't help but completely transported back in time, I think, when you come in here. And the sheer opulence, the sheer elegance, and the sheer scale of design is just extraordinary. I mean, if this building was commissioned to remember this man, and quite clearly he's taking inspiration from all of these wonderful places he's been and he's going, and was really supposed to represent who he was and more importantly, I think, what he wanted to be remembered for. And I think why this is probably so important to understanding Richard, understanding this period, is that the interiors of Warwick Castle have been completely irretrievably changed, over the centuries. And so we have almost no idea exactly what it would have looked like, and more importantly, probably felt like to be inside the very rich, splendid inner chambers of his private home.
Yes, but of course, we do have this wonderful room that survives, and if Warwick Castle was decorated to the same high quality that the Beauchamp Chapel was decorated, then, my word, what a wonderful place it would have been. Talking more specifically about the decoration of the chapel, of course, the building work really started here almost as soon as Richard died in 1439. In his will, actually, this was written: "In such place as I have devised, which is known well, there be made a chapel of Our Lady, well, fair, and goodly built. Within the middle of the chapel I will that my tomb be made." And indeed, structurally, this space is absolutely marvellous. The Gothic ribbed vaulting that you see in the ceiling is just so decorative. And this entire room is an art historian, an architectural historian's dream. We know that Richard, in this space, was really employing some of his own family's masons, and lots of analysis has been done on the structure of it. It actually relates a great deal to Gothic structures found particularly in the west of England. It bears some resemblance to parts of Gloucester Cathedral and also other very significant priories and churches located in the west of England. And it seems that Richard's masons were sought out by specific priors in the west of England, so highly regarded were they. And really this chapel sets so many precedents. I mean, it's obvious that Richard had taken, or his masons had taken, everything that was sort of known before but has outdone them completely. Really, the centre point of this entire chapel is his marvellous gilded bronze effigy, which was right in the centre of the room. Art historians have been very clear to make out that really this effigy is unprecedented for aristocrats. It is the only example in its period of a cast metal effigy outside of the royal family. I mean, to see its equivalents, you have to go to Canterbury Cathedral to see the Black Prince's effigy, or even to the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster, all, of course, built after this period. We know actually a lot about the design of this room too, because, again, wonderful records survive, telling us exactly who was involved. The effigy was cast by William Austin of London, that it was gilded, in fact, by a fellow called Bartholomew Lamspring, who was known as a Dutchman. Again, this makes a wonderful point, I think, that this very difficult technique of gilding, effectively a Latin or copper alloy bronze figure to be gilded with gold, was still a very new technology. So foreigners were sought out to do it. A chap called Roger Webb was employed, who was a barber, perhaps to give an idea of the anatomy of the figure. And most importantly, also a man called John Massingham was employed as a carver, perhaps to carve the Purbeck marble base on which this effigy sits.
It's so extraordinary. How exactly was it done?
Well, we know exactly from the records that an actual wooden pattern was first made of the figure before it was cast into this bronze alloy. So, a very sophisticated method of production would have been used. And again, looking at the details, one just can't help but fall in love with him. The way that his face is so full of character, the way that his hands and also his face, his temples, have veins running through them. It's almost like you can feel that blood is pulsing through this metal figure. And also, particularly, I think the fact that he has his hands open is this wonderful sense of faith, in a way, because the reason that he doesn't have his hands closed, is believed, is because allowing his hands to be open, this figure, this effigy, can actually look right up to the ceiling, to a ceiling boss, where, of course, the Virgin and Child is sat in plaster right on the ceiling. So it's this wonderful, again, this profound sense of faith.
And of course, one of the best things about this effigy is that we see Richard wearing armour. I mean, clearly the kind of representation of a soldier is something that even after death he wanted to be remembered for.
Yes, of course, Richard de Beauchamp here is depicted as that chivalric knight. Indeed, the armour is so well detailed that we can tell that it was undoubtedly inspired by an original armour which must have been made in Italy. English Gothic armour, for example, didn't look very much like the one that you see there. It was more decorative in cusp, but it's such a perfect depiction of armour that if he was a real figure, he could have walked up. It would have all worked perfectly. Here in this one tomb, you have this magnificent union of both knight, courtier, politician, but also of a Christian and patron of the arts, which really makes this whole space, this tomb, so very important and special.
And Adam, I can't help but look up and get completely lost in some of the amazing colours in this glass. What do we know about that?
Well, yes, the Beauchamp Chapel at Warwick has one of the most exquisite selection of medieval stained glass that survives. And indeed, some art historians have even gone as far to say that this stained glass in this room was the most expensive example of the medieval period. This room, this entire chapel, cost Richard at least £2,482, which was an absolutely enormous figure. The glass is interesting. The main section at the back, which must have once upon a time been the centrepiece, unfortunately was destroyed by Cromwellian vandals in the 17th century. That's a shame. But the pieces that do survive, that are remarkable, are the upper stories of the windows, where we actually have musical angels playing and singing along, undoubtedly, to the divine harmonies of heaven. The maker of the stained glass, who is known, his name was John Prude, or Prud. He was in fact the royal glazier. So again, this chapel was using only the best craftsmen and artists of their day. And indeed, if we look closely, we can see that each of the angels which are gathered around in this scene are playing various forms of musical instruments which date to the medieval period. We have organs, we have harps, we have lutes, we have all sorts of percussion instruments. It is an absolute musical feast. And really, looking at this, it's obvious that Richard Beauchamp's executors, and perhaps Richard Beauchamp himself, wanted us to hear music in this space, undoubtedly. Richard Beauchamp was actually also a patron of significant musicians. Several names have survived to us and have been written about by a scholar called Alexandra Buckle. The household chapel that Richard kept consisted of 18 men, 9 choristers, and he was also a patron of composers such as Robert Sherbury, who was a musician in the Chapel Royal, in fact. Another being John Sowersby, who was a younger contemporary of the great John Dunstable. Sowersby was paid about £10 a year by Beauchamp and travelled with him throughout Europe, including at the Council of Constance.
And is that music sheets I can see painted into the glass as well?
Yes, you're absolutely right. You must have good eyes. The musical angels are so well depicted that we can see that many of them are actually holding up sheets of music, which can be read to this very day. Richard Beauchamp really wanted to have music performed in this space very often. It's a wonderful space for sound, I have to say. Hopefully you can hear on this podcast. Beauchamp wanted enormous amounts of masses said in his honour after his death, including particularly having lots of so-called lady masses, which had a very heavy emphasis on music and these heavenly alleluias. Music was undoubtedly an essential part of this cultural experience too. Here is an arrangement for solo lute of the Gaudeamus Omnes which appears in the stained glass windows of the Beauchamp Chapel.